Welcome, everyone. I'm Dani Klein Modisett, the founder and CEO of Laughter on Call, and we create connection through laughter. We're excited to have you here today, but we're super, super excited to have Adria because, as everyone knows, we actually launched in the healthcare space, helping people with dementia. And by people, I mean my mother initially. And let's just say it's her birthday today. May she rest in peace. Yay, thanks, Mom. I think she'd be very excited that we're talking about her, and that we have this specific guest today because Adria Thompson is like the bomb. Can I say that? Is that very 80s? But she truly, truly is, especially in this space. So I'll just tell you a little bit about her illustrious background. She's a speech language pathologist, certified dementia practitioner, certified Montessori dementia care professional, with a master's from Eastern Kentucky University. And I just found out she teaches there too. So what up? So exciting. So, so grateful to have you here. And
Thanks for having me. This is awesome.
okay, cool. All right. So you know what I would love to know just at the top, which
Okay.
is like how you got here. And I don't mean like here today. I know you're in Kentucky,
Mhm.
but I mean here like so impassioned and focused on this really important subject.
Yeah. So I'm a speech language pathologist. I have been for 10, 11 years now. And I worked for many, many years in long-term care. So working in nursing homes, assisted living, memory care. And I just grew a passion for working with my patients with dementia. Absolutely just were drawn to them. And I think that comes from my personality. Like I like challenges. I like working with people who, like everyone else, struggles to, which I found that many times whenever there were challenges in these care communities, I would just be like, let me at them, like let me try, let me see if I can help. And so that's really just kind of how I started working with individuals with dementia. Unfortunately, it was because they experienced some challenges in living in these communities. And so I found myself in a situation over and over again where I was their advocate. I was the one that was going to bat for them. And it was around the same time that my own grandmother was diagnosed with dementia. So I started seeing, like, professionally and personally, the challenges that existed for individuals living with dementia, but also the lack of resources and understanding of what they're going through. And yeah, so that's kind of like the path as far as like personally and professionally to getting to where I now have a passion for working with and advocating for people with dementia.
Yeah, I mean, you have more than a passion. You have 480,000 people on social media following you now. So it's definitely your lane, like you're in the zone. And it's so interesting to hear you say about like you're drawn to the most difficult, you were just drawn to difficult personalities because as comedians, like, we always want to get that one person who's not laughing.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's why I think, me too, like when I had the idea to like bring a comedian, it was like, oh, because comedians like that super challenge, the one who's not gonna laugh. So
yeah.
I totally I love that that was your instinct and also just speaks really so much to your character that like that's what you're, drawn to do, to solve those problems. And
Yeah.
obviously communication is such a big challenge. So you make lots of videos, incredibly helpful videos. Like truly, I wish that you had made these videos when I was taking care of my mother because they're so specific. And I'm just curious how you came to understand that video was like the way to reach this community.
Yeah, that's a good question. I do. I have lots of videos. I have over 500 videos at this point. And so really the catalyst for me making videos was a selfish one, if I'm being totally honest. Around the time that I started BeLight Care, my husband and I moved from Kentucky to Washington State for his job. And so I had kind of built a reputation and I had a position where I was training other physical occupational speech therapist and how to work with people with dementia. So I had the reputation in Kentucky of like being the dementia speech therapist. And so when I moved to Washington State, no one knew me. Like I was just kind of starting over, I felt like. And so when I got a job working at a nursing home there, and I went to the executive director and was like, "Hey, can you let me train your staff? Like I see, these gaps." And they're just like, "But you're a speech therapist, right? Like we have social workers, we have nurses that do that. Like, what does a speech therapist have anything to do with people with dementia? Like, they talk just fine, right?" And so I realized, and I'd seen this many, many times over my career, is that people just don't understand a speech therapist's role in working with people with dementia. And so I was like, I'll show them. So I kind of had the idea of like, I'm going to show them, literally show them that
Mhm.
I have expertise in this area. And so I just started creating these videos like in my living room of just like, here's what I would do in this situation. Like, here's an example of my teaching. And so I imagined that I would use these videos as just proof of my expertise so that I could get into communities to train. And I was not at all expecting to become a dementia influencer by any means, but that's kind of what ended up happening.
It's so funny because when they went to write your bio, they said influencer, and I was like, oh, don't say that. Like she's so much more than that because I'm 150 years old. So I'm like, oh, you can't say it. But it's like such a huge compliment and so amazing that you've created this and that you're able to reach people in this way. So because as we know, the statistics are really exponential for this. So now I'm interested in the speech pathology kind of lens because
Yeah.
I don't think people appreciate that. And yet, yeah, I'm going to let you talk. I don't need to.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, not a lot of people understand when you think of speech therapy, you think of like kids that can't say their R's, right? Like I had speech therapy when I was for 5 years when I was younger for my R's and S's and things. And so that's what most people are exposed to as far as the role of a speech therapist. And that is a huge, like, important part of our scope of practice is working with children on speech specifically. But I think our name, speech language pathologist and speech therapist, those can be used interchangeably, just so you know.
Mhm.
It's the same thing, but basically, we serve three main areas, which is communication. So speech definitely falls under that umbrella, but also like voice quality and loudness. But then also like communication is also receptive language, so understanding the speech of others, understanding reading and writing. So all forms of communication and also social communication. So pragmatics and understanding like how to interact with people and what social cues mean. So that's all the communication umbrella. We also help with cognition. So any thinking skills that includes memory, problem solving, reasoning, and then also swallowing. So any disorders of swallowing anywhere from when food or drink enters your lips to where it empties into your stomach. We are the experts in assessing and treating that. So, speech therapists, yes, do like a ton of things. And so, for individuals with dementia, most of what we do there is that communication and cognition, like where those two meet. So when someone is experiencing difficulty following directions to take a shower, it's not because they can't reach their shoulder to scrub it, right? It's because they don't understand what's going on. They don't always know the instructions that you're giving them, or they're not able to express themselves to say, hey, wait just a second. I feel a little uncomfortable. Can we make the temperature a little different? Right? Their communication is broken down to the point where it just becomes no, right? So
Right, right.
communication underlies every aspect of care. And that's where we
Yeah.
come in.
Yeah, communication underlines every aspect of life is
Yes.
it's so interesting to
Yeah.
hear you break it down so beautifully, which is your gift. You just have a way of communicating that makes everything like I get it, and I'm not a speech pathologist, clearly. But the idea of tone of voice and how just that is so important in whether you're able to connect with someone because
Yeah.
and particularly in cognitive decline because they're so sensitive, so even that is something that can be, I guess, from your point of view, like you can educate. I mean, definitely, you can educate people.
Yeah.
I think the first step is awareness, right? If you don't know that you have a tone of voice that's not engaging, that would be the first step. And
Yeah.
when you work with, so you teach caregiver entire communities, right?
Yeah. So, my background when I was in long-term care, the biggest part of my time was interacting with the person with dementia, getting to know them really well, what makes them tick, what their interests are, and but then also how can I take what skills they have and then support them in a way to make them more successful. And so then once I really understood that about a person, then I turned around and shared all of that with every person that comes in contact with them. So
Mhm.
definitely aides, nurses, but the kitchen staff, the activities, the family
Totally.
members of just like, here's what I found about them, and here's how we can support them in a better way. And so much of that is bringing to light things that are seem so insignificant, like tone of voice, like pace of speech, like body language, all of those things, and teaching a person and modeling for them what a huge difference it can make when you
Hmm.
like when you make those adaptations.
Hmm. So doesn't it require, I mean, what you're talking about is so individualized.
Yes.
So it really, all I think about is the ratio of caregiver to resident in these communities
Mhm.
because they don't have the time. Like, how do you kind of quicken the or accelerate the understanding of the individual because they don't like, is there like a checklist or what do you like? And I think that's important for families too. Like, what
Mhm.
are some of the key? I know you talked about tone of voice, but I'm interested in like what are some of the like pacing? That's really interesting. We've also found that like, mirroring is such a big part of the relationship. And so even your face, like making people aware of their face. So
Mhm.
I'm curious if there's anything else that you have found.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. It is very nuanced and individualized as far as like the specific recommendations, but there are certainly some of those communication strategies that largely work not just with people with dementia, but anyone who is struggling cognitively. And so one of my favorite tips, which is so practical and I feel like people can like really implement quickly, is decreasing the use of pronouns that you use in everyday speech. So, for example, pronouns that we use he, she, it, that, those, these, and it's any word that kind of is put into place of a noun. So, instead of saying like your phone, you might reference it as it. Okay, you might reference it. Okay, so when we're speaking about something, let's say I went to the store and I saw Dani. She was telling me all about her incredible trip to Spain. Have you ever been there before? She said she loved it. I cannot wait to go. I was talking to her about planning a trip for myself. Right? By the end of that story, I'm saying it and that and there and she, and I'm not referencing Dani and Spain anymore. I'm just using all of these pronouns. And for a person who has short term memory loss, they begin, and attention deficits, they begin to lose track of the conversation pretty quickly. And so, even though that is, just a few seconds long, by the end of that, most people who are, especially in the more moderate stages of dementia, will have lost it completely and be like, who? Where? What? Right? And so, even just reminding a person to refer back to the specific thing that you're talking about frequently. So I saw Dani at the grocery store. Dani was telling me about this trip to Spain. She had such a good time in Spain. Have you ever been to Spain? I would love to go. Right? We don't have to not use pronouns at all, but just decreasing the use and referring back to what we're talking about. Such a practical and like a way to make them more successful in that conversation just by making that little change.
Like I love this, and now I think you have to come train our comedians because something that you have a natural gift for, and I've noticed from your videos and even just talking to you now, is like you're not afraid to talk, right?
Sure.
Like
Mhm.
you like to talk. You just spun a whole yarn about me going to Spain,
Yeah.
right? But to do it with the kind of information that you just gave, which is to be specific about not using pronouns and kind of having comedians have that information, I think would be so helpful. And because it builds that connection, because otherwise, you know, it's as you say, people, they're listening and then they're not listening anymore, and then
Mhm.
you've lost them.
Yeah.
So I think this is so brilliant. All right, someone has a question already. What is happening? Okay. Pacing on, can you talk more about pacing? Oh, it's Mitchell. We love Mitchell. Mitchell's our regular at our Hilarity for Charity events. Okay.
Awesome.
Pacing.
Yeah.
Pacing.
So pacing of a conversation matters, and that just references the speed at which we're talking. So the speed at which you and I are talking right now might not be the best speed for someone who has to have a little bit longer time for processing for whatever reason, dementia, short-term memory loss, processing information. So when a person pauses, like I did just there, not only does that give a person a little bit more time to process what I just said, but it draws your attention, doesn't it?
Oh
Right?
my gosh, that was crazy. I thought you were
Right.
there was a
Immediately
problem,
when someone pauses, you're like, you lean in. Like you're like, are they okay? Did my computer freeze?
but
Like, right?
totally.
So when we add pauses in our conversations, it allows a little extra time for a person to process through what was just said, but also it increases their attention. They're automatically going to be leaning in and paying more attention, and you were probably on the edge of your seat to see what it was I was going to say next. Like, is she okay?
Right.
Right? Yeah. So that's what we mean by pacing is do we just talk all the time and really quickly and like, come on, let's go. Are you hungry or do you want something to eat? What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? What do you think? Do you want this? Do you want that? That is so overwhelming, but also you start to tune it out. It just becomes noise. And so if we can be more mindful of strategically using the pace of our speech, then we will give them extra time to process what we said, but then also make sure that they stay tuned in at the times where they need to. So that's pacing.
So good. So good. And it's so interesting because for a while I was talking about, not when you're not sure where in cognitive decline, like where in the spectrum they are, and wanting to still ask some questions and to appear curious,
Mhm.
but not wanting to agitate, right?
Mhm.
So asking a question and then if you feel like it's becoming upsetting to jump in with some kind of answer, just make something up, talk about yourself, whatever.
Mhm.
um and I've heard that the Alzheimer's, like I used to call it like the 3 to 5 second rule, and the Alzheimer's Association had talked about that. But studying your work and some other people recently, I've realized that not so much with the jumping in. Like maybe give people the space, as you just said, to like, and not, they don't have to be at our time frame,
Mhm. Yeah.
so
Yeah. And I've found that sometimes when I ask a question, I for to someone with dementia and I wait, anything more than 10 seconds feels like a really long time. But sometimes an answer comes like much longer than you think because they need time to process, but then they also need time to formulate the response. And
Mm,
every time you jump in, and even if you're rephrasing the question or you're repeating it, you're like starting a clock over, like getting them back to, okay, I got to start over and think through things. And so sometimes when I wait like an extended amount of time on a response, sometimes it never comes, and that's
mhm,
okay.
mhm.
But sometimes it does. And in the meantime, you just kind of sit there with a nice looking face and be together. Like that's still important too.
Yeah, I mean, you're so speaking to this kind of really important comedy concept of imperfection. It's not a comedy concept, it's like a life concept. But that's what you're talking about, is just being with what is. And it's
Mm,
such a, it ends up being, and I've talked to other people in this space that talk about this, like it ends up being a spiritual experience to show up for this because
mm,
there's so many pauses and there's so many opportunities to not be present. And
mhm,
so disciplining ourselves to be present with
mhm.
that silence, it ends up being like the very thing that everyone goes to yoga and meditation for,
Yeah.
is to be like present with the moment.
And to have a spirit of like expectation, like they are going to respond and you're willing to wait for it. I think that's so important. My grandmother's still living with dementia, but she has someone, like when I visit, there are others around often that I'll speak to, and even individuals who are in the, the latest stages of dementia, the most severe or progressed, that can't necessarily talk to people. They might verbalize some
Mhm.
words, but there are times where I'll go and say, like, "Hi, how are you?" And just wait with that spirit of expectation. Like, it's so different than like, "Hi, how are you?" and still being silent but moving on like physically. Um, you get less response that way. And there are so many times where people will be like, "Why? How did she talk to you? She never talks to anybody else." And the truth is that like I'm willing to wait. And
Mm.
and not everybody is. And it's not necessarily, I guess, willing, but I'm comfortable with waiting.
Well, the positive expectation, I mean, that's just a tool we should all write down right now in every
Mhm.
conversation, like to have a positive expectation. And we have someone who's been working with Laughter on Call, Nikki Gazelle. She's so gifted, and she has what you're talking about, like positive expectation in her experience, in her engagement with people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it does come back to that again, that mirroring idea of like,
Mhm.
if I'm coming at you with like, yeah, I'm gonna
Mhm.
be here and I'm excited to see you, that's
Mhm.
very different than, oh well, here we are.
Yeah. Is she ever
God,
gonna say something? This is
I
getting,
don't know.
yeah.
You didn't like it, this is terrible. I don't like it here. I know you don't, it's like
Yeah.
it's crazy. And it's not even necessarily verbal,
Mm.
right? Like
Yeah.
you're not saying, I can't wait to hear your answer, you know?
I'm waiting. I'm waiting. Go ahead. Yeah.
But just that presence is so, so important. Um, and so on in your videos, you break down aggression and why aggression is, so uh, everywhere in Alzheimer's. These people are very aggressive, and I'm wondering if you could just share with us your insight about that.
Yeah. Uh, it's been really fun. Like, it's shifting roles as a professor at Eastern Kentucky University because this last semester I've taught neurology in our speech therapy department. And I've revisited so much about the brain that I learned in grad school, but like now, after having all this experience working with real humans, it's like I come at this material so differently. And I feel like busting full of content after, learning and teaching more about the brain. But really, the foundational part, the reason why people with dementia will often be more aggressive or combative, fill in the blank, whatever you want to describe it, it's because they feel unsafe. And so when any human feels unsafe, we behave in ways that are not necessarily characteristic of us,
Hmm.
right? So we're going to be that the either, the fight or flight kind of thing. A person either shuts down and hides, or they are aggressive. And so that energy, that negative energy that we see sometimes, is just a response of their fight or flight system, which exists in the brain in a place called the amygdala. And interestingly, in dementia, a lot of parts of the brain are damaged, and there are deficits and it's not working as well. but often the amygdala for pretty far into the progression is still firing just fine. So, unfortunately, what we're left with is a brain that is reactive, but it doesn't necessarily have the frontal lobe capacity, those executive functions of inhibition, pulling back those reins on strong feelings. And so when a person with dementia is going to be more easily triggered into fight or flight response because they are having misunderstandings of their environment.
Hmm.
Something that to us does not look like a threat, to them does, because they're confused about who the people are in their environment and where they are. So they're going to be more easily triggered. The response is going to be as strong as it's ever been, if not more so, because then we don't have anything reining it back.
Right.
And then the third component of that is that they can't get out of that fight or flight mode as easily as someone who is what we might consider neurotypical.
Mm.
So, for example, if you were to hear a really loud bang on my side of the camera and I
Mhm.
turned really quick to look, um, both you and I are going to have some kind of like response, right? Our heart rate might increase, we might lean in, I might start sweating, all of those things that are natural in that fight or flight response. But what I can do, because I have an intact cognition, as far as I'm aware, is that I can look around my space and I can see things that maybe have changed since the last time I looked at it. So that takes memory, that takes visual scanning, that takes understanding of your environment. So if I turned around and I saw a picture that was once on the wall, now on the ground, then that all of a sudden, all these things start clicking together. And I'm like, oh, my life is not in danger. That loud sound was just a picture falling. And
Mhm.
so I can cognitively talk my body into coming out of that fight or flight response because the danger has passed. But for
Mhm.
someone with dementia who doesn't have all of those intact skills, they're going to lack the ability to look around their environment and determine appropriately if the danger is real or not. And so they're
Mhm.
just going to stay in it.
Mhm.
And so when we're interacting with someone who is aggressive or who is combative, we need to realize that potentially they are just misinterpreting danger. So
Mhm.
the way that we respond is not in restraint or, telling them, chill out, stop doing that. Like, you're fine.
Right.
How do we make them feel safe? So often that can look like getting on their level, looking them in the eyes and saying, you are safe.
Mm.
Everything's okay. And modeling that mirroring, showing my body is relaxed, your body can be relaxed. There's no danger here. But
Mhm.
unfortunately, what can happen, especially in care communities, is if someone starts to get aggressive, then people start responding, and then voices get louder, and then it's just feeding that misinterpretation of, oh yeah, there is danger, and I'm gonna stay in this response.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's kind of a long answer, but I
No,
hope
it's a great answer. I mean, it really explains it. And, that idea, I definitely experienced that, the no editor with my mother. Like
yeah,
and of course, I thought it was funny. Like I thought that was one of the perks. But,
yeah,
you know, there's a real difference between an 84-year-old woman, frail woman getting angry
mhm,
and a former athlete, a male athlete, not to be gendered here, but like someone who's
yeah,
very strong and big getting angry. And that's a big challenge within the community is, and I just love that idea. And I did that actually. I took my mother on a plane with advanced dementia from New York to LA. And it's
yeah,
so interesting. I actually, she was okay. And then she wasn't. And
mhm,
we're on a plane. And I did that exact thing of looking her in the eye and saying, you're fine, you're okay, and I love you. And it was very
yeah,
like
yeah,
very intense. But it did work. So
yeah,
I think, again, it just feels like in communities, it's so hard to, when your ratio is 6-1 or 7-1 or 12-1,
mhm.
it's very, very challenging. So,
It is, yeah, it is. And when we're putting many people who have dementia in the same space, they can trigger each other into fight or flight, right? Like, one small thing can then just add on top of it. So, another a good way to kind of get somebody out of that is to just give them space and time. Is just to let their body calm down. And so
Mhm.
on a plane, that might not be possible, like let's get you somewhere else. That's not really possible, but it's yeah, we have to think through like there is the theme of my whole career is what I told myself when I was working with people with dementia in care communities, and what I still strongly believe now is that everything someone with dementia does makes sense to them. There's that we might perceive their behavior as unreasonable, but for them there is a logical explanation for their behavior. And so we have to get into their headspace and think, in what situation would this make sense? And how can
Hmm.
I change that perspective in them?
Right. How can I get into their perspective?
Yeah.
Right, right,
How can I get into their world? Consider what is it that's making them feel unsafe, and then how can we work through that? Like, and sometimes, for some people, especially with Lewy body dementia, they see visual hallucinations. And so they visually will see things in their environment. Like I worked with a woman who would frequently see fire. And so looking her in the eyes and saying you're safe is not going to work if the room is burning down around us, right? Like she's still not going to believe
uh,
me. And
right.
so, so in that situation, getting in her perspective, knowing that, okay, if this room's on fire in her brain, then we need to get to another room. And then I'm going to come back to this room and like make the fire go away, right? So moving her into a different environment, saying, I've called the fire station, they're on their way. A few
Right.
seconds later, I come around the corner. They were here. They got it out. Everything's okay. So it just depends. Like we do have to know the person. You have to know what kind of dementia they have. You got to know their patterns and their concerns. But it's the thing that I always want to do in my videos and in any training is to just help people know that there is hope. Like there is hope. There is potential for something to work. The worst spot we can get in as caregivers, professional or personal, is to feel like nothing works.
Right. Right. I mean, what you're talking about, Adria, is improvisation. That's what's so
Yeah,
interesting
it is.
to me. Like that's what you're saying. Yeah, oh, there's a fire. You're right. Let's go
Mhm.
over here and you'll
Yeah,
be out of harm's way, and I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna put the fire out. Like it's
yeah,
all storytelling.
100%. And
So
earlier when you were talking about like, when we were talking about pacing and those kind of things as far as comedy goes, I'm like, everything is improvisation. I felt like, and that's why I loved working in care communities so much. I mean, it was mentally exhausting at the end of the day because you're all the time just like thinking on your toes, like, what world are we living in right now? And like,
right.
what role am I playing, And you're just constantly just having to be creative and be quick and be convincing,
Yeah.
honestly.
Yeah. I love it. You're like an ad for why comedians should become caregivers. Like
Seriously.
so it's so well suited to that kind of creativity
Yeah.
and with the added piece of empathy, right? And I find that the only people who want to work with laughter on call are people who have empathy,
Yeah.
who either, to just feel it. So, but it's so interesting to to hear you confirm all this. Okay, so one other thing that I loved in your video, I mean, I love them all, but the one about facial recognition, how people feel like they don't like, well, they don't, and I've had people say this to me when I suggest, show up anyway, just show up, because showing up is a big part of my message.
Yeah.
And they'll say, well, it doesn't matter because they don't even know who I am. They don't even, And so I was so fascinated by what you had to say about that.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a condition called prosopagnosia, which is basically face blindness. And it's typically when the right parietal lobe, which is kind of around this area in our brain, when that begins to be affected by any kind of neurological condition, but in this situation, dementia, it can make someone have difficulty recognizing a person's face just based on what it looks like. And so there are many reasons why someone might not recognize a person, but this is definitely one of the biggest reasons. It's just because the face becomes this just like complex series of textures and colors, and it doesn't end up having meaning anymore. And so that could be why someone doesn't like, yeah, that people like, they don't even know me anymore. Well, they might not be able to recognize your face. And that's different than not knowing you anymore or not
Right.
caring about you anymore or feeling cared for in your presence anymore. And so face blindness is a neurological condition that can happen because of dementia. But also environment plays a big role. If they think they're on a cruise ship and then all of a sudden their daughter walks in the room, that might not make sense to them. So, having an understanding of where they think they are, how old they think they are,
Mm,
that's a huge one. Where if you ask a person with dementia how old they are and they're actually 95, but they tell you they're 55, well, of course they're going to have confusion when their 60-year-old daughter walks in the room because all of a sudden, if they're 55, they wouldn't have a child that's 60 years old. So instead, they're going to call their daughter their mom or their sister, right? So it's not
oh,
that they don't know you. They know that you belong to them, but they just don't
right.
understand the relationship anymore. And it's so challenging to convince a person to still visit someone. I mean, I don't know that I've given up that battle, but it's tricky. But sometimes understanding why someone is not identifying you can take the scariness of it away.
Yeah, could you say again about even if they don't, see your face, like your spirit, your energy? Like, I just think we cannot hear that enough and we cannot send that message out enough. So I'm just gonna ask
Yeah.
you to repeat it.
Mhm. Just because someone with dementia cannot say your name or recognize your relationship with them immediately upon seeing you does not mean that they don't know you. They don't heart wise know you, that they don't love you, and that they don't feel cared for in your presence because our interactions with other humans are about way more than recognizing each other. It's about being with each other. And that still can happen with someone with dementia, someone that you love.
I'm I'm very, very moved by what you just said. So I'm so glad that you said it. And for those of you joining or just joined in the middle, it's actually my mother's birthday today, unplanned. And that's really like what Adria just said is like what I discovered to be the most important thing and the most important kind of message of this kind of work is that it matters. It matters. And so I just am such a fan. Okay. So, you also talk about, obviously we had the big blood test approval this week.
Yeah.
So, so that's great. It's a great step for sure. You make a point of saying, don't trust anyone who says they're going to cure dementia. Or
Yeah.
they have the thing. And
Mhm.
I'm wondering if you can just share a bit of that with us, given, this week.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, my message is I'm not super specific about maybe what I'm referencing, but we all know when we see it, which is when a person or a company claims to have the cure for dementia. My request for you when you encounter that is to just be cautious. And because the reason for that is that dementia is actually just a generalized term for many conditions, many diagnoses under that. So, specifically, we have Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, Huntington's disease, vascular dementia, Lewy body, Korsakoff syndrome, the list goes on. And each one of those diagnoses cause cognitive changes, and those cognitive changes make it difficult for a person to care for themselves. And those are the two criteria to be considered dementia, essentially. if we can kind of boil it down to two simple things: a change in cognition, and that change affects a person's ability to care for themselves.
Hmm.
So every single one of those individual diagnoses that causes those two things, they all have different pathologies, which means like causes in the brain. They're caused by different proteins or a blockage of blood flow to the brain. There's all kinds of different um, pathologies for these different kinds of dementia. So
Hmm.
therefore, the cure and the prevention, the reversal, all of those things for dementia at large, that doesn't exist. It will
Hmm.
happen for the individual types, but if you see, do these 5 things or take these 3 supplements to cure dementia, it just doesn't work that way. Dementia is like saying curing mental health disorders, right? Or curing cancer. They're all caused by different things. They
Hmm.
all have different, prognosis, and some are genetic, some are not. So it's going to look different. So just be cautious.
Hmm.
And what you reference is the blood test through the FDA. That's actually going to help us diagnose
Right.
Alzheimer's disease. And so it's not curing, reversing anything, but what it is going to do is definitively, well, I think it's like 93%, but more definitively diagnose Alzheimer's disease in a person who is still living. So that's huge because in 20 years ago, they said you could only diagnose Alzheimer's post-mortem at an autopsy.
Right.
In the last 10 years, it's been like we're better at it clinically, just seeing symptoms, but now we have a blood test, which will be much more helpful.
Right. Although they are making the distinction that the blood test should be given to people who are already exhibiting
Right.
signs,
Yeah.
because it is possible to have amyloid plaque, which is everyone, that's what they're measuring on the
Mhm.
brain, and not exhibit signs
Yeah.
of dementia. So they're really trying to fine tune it and have both be present in order to trigger somebody to pay for the test, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Do we have any questions? No questions. Oh, if anyone has any questions, please send them in. This would be a great time to do that. Um, and so, Adria, I'm curious what you think, 5 to 10 years, like, are we going to make progress in ending the stigma and kind of bringing more people in? I know it's a very big question, but I'm curious.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that we're talking about dementia more than we ever have. And I know that's because I'm just in this world and so I'm
Right,
exposed to it more. But I think at large, we're hearing it more often, not always in a positive way, but we got to start somewhere. So at least we're talking about it. Um, and I think I recently did a TEDx talk, and one thing that I really encouraged was for younger people to care about dementia, because I think that the younger generations, which I'll slip myself into that
oh,
category still, is like we're more open to talking about mental health, right? Like to say, like, I'm struggling, like, I don't have it all together, I take medication, I go to therapy, like, more so than in generations past. The younger generation is being much more comfortable having that conversation. We're seeing stigma, these conversations around stigma in the autism community.
right.
So that's fantastic. And so I'm just hoping that dementia, we can kind of ride that wave to some degree, to say, you know what, yeah, dementia is also considered being neurodiverse. It's being cognitively different, having, yeah, being in this world in a different way. And so, like, there should be space and room for us to talk about that. So I do think that stigma is decreasing. Unfortunately, the cases of dementia, though, are going to increase, um,
Right.
because baby boomers are aging. So we're going to have to talk about it one way or
Yeah.
another.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of years ago, because I'm a little bit older. I think I said that earlier. Um, when people used to say, "Oh, she has cancer,"
Yeah.
and you whispered it, and now, like, people write comedy shows about it.
Yeah.
So I think it's a little bit. I do feel like it's a little bit on that path.
Yeah.
Okay, we do have a question. Can short-term memory loss get significant before any other symptoms are noticeable? My mom is not holding on to so many details of the previous days, but that's the majority of what we are seeing. Does that sound like Alzheimer's?
It does. So with each different type of dementia, we see like a predominant symptom, especially at the very beginning. And so for Alzheimer's disease, short-term memory loss is the classic um, predominant and first symptom that we see. And so that can present itself as repetitive storytelling, repetitive question asking, or misplacing or losing things. And that's because Alzheimer's disease impacts a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is responsible for storing memories. So everything that we experience goes into the hippocampus, and it decides whether it's going to hold on to that information or not. And when the hippocampus is damaged, it doesn't store information very often, as much as it used to. And so we're going to see things not being held on to. And yeah, that's pretty classic for Alzheimer's disease, which Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so curious, what is, if there was, I know we have another question, I think, but if there was one thing that you would tell people who are dealing with Alzheimer's or have a loved one with Alzheimer's, like what's one way that we can make a difference as individuals?
Mm, okay, that's a big question. One way, okay, so if we have someone with dementia in our life, I think the biggest thing is just to like continue to see them as a person, see them through the lens of who they are rather than the lens of what diagnosis they have. And what I mean by that is like, I think as soon as someone starts to show signs of dementia, it's like that's all we can ever think of when we look at them. It's all we can ever consider when we interact with them or make choices for them and with them. But first and foremost, this is a human being that we love. They still have their same values and their character, and they're going to express it in different ways. But we need to, you know, especially at the beginning of that process, we need to allow them as much space and opportunities as we can to allow them to tell us what they want for their future while they can, to make decisions for themselves, because it's going to make their life more dignified and more in line with what they truly want, but also it's going to make the caregiving journey easier too, because we're going to have more of a path forward. So I loving someone with dementia myself. I know it's easier said than done, but just seeing them through the lens of who they are, and then dementia being a secondary part of them.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I love the idea of showing up with authenticity to what is and
Mhm.
who but not losing who the person was. And we had a client for many, many months, beloved, and his wife, when I went and met with her, she said, you know what Sydney, who is a comedian that was caring for him, what Sydney does is give him his dignity. He gives him choice. And whereas we've all seen a lot of like, oh, well, she doesn't look good, that and that never happens with laughter on con and your people. I'm sure it's like you want to be connected with them and present with them and give them options while you still can.
Yeah. And I had a this reminds me of this experience I had at a conference just 2 weekends ago, where it was actually at the Association of Frontotemporal Dementia. I had a table for my videos and stuff, talking to people about it. And there was a man who came up to a table next to me, and someone said, so what's your relationship with FTD? Because they were caregivers, they were medical professionals, and he says, well, I have it. And she was like, oh, okay. And he goes, yeah, everybody just treats me like a kid. And he just walked away. And I was like, oh my gosh. And just like seeing him, like he was just like so distraught. Like, yes, everyone treats me like a kid. Like, that's all I know is, I think that's what he says. Like, all I know is that people just treat me like a kid. And I was like, in that moment, I'm like,
Mm.
well, first of all, I turned around to my husband because he was helping me, and I was like, I told him what he said, and I was like, I'm gonna treat him like a man. And my husband's like, please don't say that out loud, actually. Like, I I know what you mean, but just don't say that out loud. But I saw him later, and he was sitting by himself in this like sitting area, and I just walked up to him and I'm just like, "Hi, my name's Adria. Do you mind if I sit?" And he had the type of dementia where frontotemporal dementia where he has difficulty communicating, which I'm like, perfect person to talk to, speech therapist here. And I didn't ask him anything about dementia. He told me stories about where he's lived and what he's done, and they were inconsistent stories. I don't know that many of them were accurate or true, but you know what? In that moment, I'm just like, wow, like that's amazing. Like,
Right,
tell me more. What did you think about that? And in that interaction, I could just see him, like his posture changing and
right,
just feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm at this dementia conference, but like this girl doesn't know I have dementia. I feel like that's what he thought. And I'm just like, that's what I want. That's what I want. And it's hard being a speech therapist, going in, working with people with dementia, because I don't want, sometimes they don't know that I'm a speech therapist. They don't know I'm
right.
a medical person. I just walk in, I want to make them feel like a human being. I want them to
Yes.
make them feel funny and smart and, interesting. And I think that's the biggest thing we can give to people.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of what we do. We'll find out who the person is, a professor, a voice teacher, and go in as the student or
Yeah,
go in as a journalist about art. They don't have to know anything other than that, you
yeah,
know? So
yeah.
I just like great minds thinking alike here, Adria. Wait, but we have another question. Okay, we just have a few minutes, but can you talk a little bit about, yeah, caring for children and caring for parents, that kind of like, you
Yeah.
know, sandwich,
Sandwich
the
generation.
sandwich.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so hard. But you know what? I think that we know that intergenerational care is like a really big, cool thing right now in senior living, where we have like daycares and elderly people kind of sharing the same space, especially people with dementia. And so it's challenging. How do you talk to your kids about the way that, mama is behaving and like how they're changing? I think there's so many nuances to this conversation, but I think just a short answer would be the skills that you have in raising your children and being creative and, having to come into moments and be different people sometimes. Those are very similar skills that we use when we're caring for someone with dementia. And honestly, children are really good at that too. They're really good at meeting people where they are and like, holding space. And so I would say, allow your children not to necessarily do the care tasks, but to be the person who makes them feel like grandma again, because that part of their personality is still very much ingrained in many people far into the diagnosis. So, allowing them to still be grandma and grandpa can be really dignifying to them, and it's a small piece of that puzzle, but it's important, I think.
Yeah, and as long as it's safe,
Yeah,
like that, just putting in the guardrails for
yeah.
that communication, but
Mhm.
otherwise, yeah, it's beautiful. My kids spent a lot of time with my mother, and it definitely, it's one of the reasons we brought her to LA. Okay, last question, Mitchell's asking is, there's so much stress, exhaustion, poor sleep that could contribute to cognitive decline for anyone. So how do you kind of tease out what's actually dementia and what could be mitigated with better habits?
Yeah, yeah, and that's a good question. Well, now that we have a blood test to diagnose Alzheimer's disease, that's going to be a big tool. But yeah, there are things that we call reversible dementias, which are things that mimic dementia, but are not actually that. So that can be things like untreated thyroid disorders, vitamin deficiencies, infections, menopause sometimes, COVID sometimes. So
Mhm.
there are things that look like dementia that actually aren't. And so one of the biggest ways that we can identify those is just to get a head to toe physical yearly. So going to your primary care and specifically saying, I'm experiencing some cognitive changes, or like my loved one is experiencing cognitive changes. Can you keep that in mind when you draw blood, when you're testing urine, like all of these things, because they need to look for specific markers. And so that little piece of information that cognition is changing is important. Because sometimes a third of people in this kind of in between world, it's called mild cognitive impairment. A third of people have a reversible condition and they get treated and they get better. A third of people kind of stay in that something might be going on, but I don't know. They stay like that forever. And then a third of people will go on to get some type of dementia. So if you are there, 2/3 of people do not go on to get to dementia. So it's important to realize that, to not be like, oh well, this is just my plight in life.
Totally.
You need to go to the doctor and address those things. And depression is called pseudo dementia, which is also can mimic dementia-like symptoms, but treated with medication or therapy, whatever your doctor recommends, it can be helpful.
So beautiful. Yes. And so thank you, Adria. Now, we always like to ask one question before we sign off. And yes, if you look in the chat, this will be uploaded to YouTube for anyone who could benefit from this amazing conversation. I'm so thrilled. Now, Adria, what is one time in your life where you were able to get to laughter and it made a situation better than you would have expected?
Mm, better to get the laughter. Okay. Well, one time my husband and I, we love to travel and we had a goal to go to all 50 states. And so we went to Hawaii. It was fantastic. And we had, instead of like staying at a resort, we decided to rent a truck with a tent on top of it so we could just like throw up our tent anywhere we were. So we went out on the beach, but our truck got stuck in the sand and we were completely isolated from any person. It was on a Friday. We knew the weekend was coming. No one would save us. It was very stressful, very terrifying. And we worked really, really hard to get that truck out of the sand, and it didn't work. And we ended up we found some people who were living on the beach, very obviously, who had been there for a while. And they came to help us, and they were the most glorious, kind people. And they were so funny, and they made us laugh so much and just made light of the situation. And they got our truck unstuck. And it was just like the most welcome laughter after several hours of trying to dig this car out of the sand. And when I think of laughter, I definitely think of that moment because it was so much needed and from an unexpected source. So.
I love that. That is a beautiful answer. All right. Well, Adria, thank you. And thank you to everyone who came and stayed engaged and asked questions. We're going to take June off, but we will be back in July with another informed, passionate guest to talk about better communication, better caregiving, all things better. So wishing everyone a happy Memorial Day weekend. And again, a very special thanks to you, Adria, for joining us and sharing your wisdom with us and everyone. Please check out Adria's videos and send them around because they make all of this accessible and actionable. And as you can see, she's delightful. So thank you
Well,
so much.
thank you.